Sir Walter Scott rightly lamented, "What a pity such a gifted creature died so early." Jane Austen lived and wrote during the period of transition from the Age of Reason to the Age of Romanticism. And to understand her works in the proper perspective, we will need to get an idea of the socio-political, literary, and philosophical ethos of both ages. The 18th century in English literature is often called the Age of Reason, not just because of the writers of the age prized and valued reason, but because, as Isobel Grundy comments, chiefly because they respected and feared the power of unreason. It is also referred to as the Neoclassic Age, opening with the restoration or the return of the stout line Charles II to the English throne in 1660, following the end of the Commonwealth and covering the period up to 1785. The period can be divided into three main phases. The first period is 1660 to 1700, the Restoration period. Then 1700 to 1745, the Augustan Age or the Age of Pope. Then third period, 1745 to 1785, the Age of Sensibility or the Age of Johnson. In the first Restoration period, the licentiousness and urbanity of life following the breaking of Puritan constraints is reflected in the literature of the age. The theatres came back to life with the contributions of William Wycherley, William Congreve, and John Dryden. Dryden was the major poet and a critic of the time, while satiristic like Samuel Butler and the Earl of Rochester also achieved recognition. The philosophical works of John Locke were also significant, as were the religious writing of John Bunyan. The Augustans, such as Alexander Pope, Jonathan Swift, and Joseph Addison, consciously imitated the literary conventions of the original Augustans, Virgil, Horace, and Ovid, all of whom wrote under the patronage of the Roman Emperor Augustus. The time was 27 BC to 14 AD. The period between the death of Alexander Pope, the time was 1744 and 1785. A year after the death of Samuel Johnson is usually referred to as the Age of Sensibility. This age witnessed a shift in literary preoccupations from neoclassical correctness as a preoccupation with rationality and restraint to a growing emphasis on instinct and feeling, two elements that would become integral to the Romantic philosophy. Or strong anti-neoclassic sensibility seemed to be rising with the poetry of Thomas Gray, William Cowper, William Collins, and others. M. H. Abrams has identified certain ideas and characteristics which distinguish the writers of the neoclassic period from the Romantics. We have summarized them as follows. The writers of the age exhibited a strong traditionalism in imitating the classical writers, thus earning for themselves the label neoclassic. They emphasized stylistic decorum and adherence to the general properties of genre. They considered literature as primarily an art from requiring certain definite skills and techniques of correctness in terms of form, structure, subject matter, etc. Their poetry was designed to yield not only instruction but also aesthetic pleasure to the reader. Art not for art's sake alone, but for humanity's sake was the central ideal of neoclassic humanism. Satires were the most popular form of both poetry and prose. The late 18th, early 19th centuries witnessed a number of significant happenings political, social, economic, and religious, which were significant to the history and social ethos of Europe and America. In 1776, the states of America declared their independence. The slave trade, with all its evils, flourished alongside the democratization of life. The French Revolution began in 1789, and the Napoleonic Wars were in progress from 1793 to 1815, the most decisive battles being those of Trafalgar and Waterloo. The religious sphere, the Methodist movement was on the rise of the many social evils, the slave trade, the exploitation of the poor, etc. Industrialization in England began to be recognized as a growing threat, even though it reached its peak only towards the middle of the 19th century. The evils of industrialization have been depicted in great detail in the works of the Victorian novelist Charles Dickens, but the description of the cast of mind and that causes them to happen, as Claire Lamont points out, was first recognized by the Romantics. The period from 1780 and 1830 is normally referred to as the Romantic period in literature. Romanticism was a reaction against the rationalism of the 18th century. Although the attack on the adequacy of reason in literature had started with the Austen satirists, it was the Romantic poets who rebelled against the emphasis on common sense and materialism which had been dominant in the preceding period. The Romantics were in search of a spiritual reality which Orthodox Christianity did not seem to offer. In their search for spiritual truth, the Romantics turned to two principal faculties which had been rejected by the rationalism of the preceding age: emotion and imagination. This trend is perhaps most eloquently summed up by John Keats, one of the poets of the younger generation of Romantics, who said, "I am certain of nothing but of the holiness of the heart's affection and the truth of imagination." The prevailing attitude of the Romantics was one of that favored innovation over tradition, spontaneity of feeling, and the power of the imagination over the adequacy of reason, the simplicity of rural life over the attractions of the urban. For the Romantics, nature was man's proper setting, not a society, and they saw man fulfilling himself only with the help of nature. External nature was dominant to them in poetry and was described with accuracy and sense of detail. The late 18th and early 19th century was a period of transition from the age of reason to the age of Romanticism, from the domination of prose literature to poetry, from the intellectual to the emotional and essential. Apart from poetry, the novel was the most popular form of literature. By the last decades of the 18th century, there was a large increase in the number of novels published. Some of the ideas we associate with the Romantics may be seen in the popular novel. One such is the cult of feelings, known otherwise as the Sensibility. The origins of the cult of Sensibility were honorable ones of philosophical belief in the innate goodness of people. A lot of 18th century fiction depicted characters whose response to life was charged with emotion. Sensibility expressed itself in human relations and in response to nature and art. But by the 1790s, novelists were warning heroines of the danger of sensibility, while the quality of sensibility in a man might enrich his nature, and excess of it in a woman might make her dangerously vulnerable. The heroine of one of Anne Radcliffe's most famous novels, The Mystery of Woodolph, is won by her father to avoid the snares of excessive sensibility. The pride of fine feeling, the romantic era of amiable minds, Jane Austen's first published novel, Sense and Sensibility, criticizes sensibility as a self-centered emotion which blinds its victims to the needs of others. The world of nightmare and the supra-real became the realm of the Gothic novel. Such in a vague medieval world, these novels were filled with dark, sinister happenings and emotions of terror, guilt, and horror. Suspense and mystery were key elements. It was Jane Austen whose work provided a break with the trend of these Gothic romances with her themes of social and domestic realism. It was also an years that saw contributions from several women novelists, and Radcliffe, as already mentioned, was prominent. There was also Fanny Burney, whose art of shaping the feminine attitudes and responses as a novelist was influential of Jane Austen. Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, could be considered the originator of the scientific Gothic and important precursor of modern science fiction. And then there was Jane Austen herself, a novelist whose relevance is evident in the number of films that have been based on her works and her continuing popularity among modern